and we can get started and have others join us as they're able to, or they'll watch us on the recording. So let us pray. On this late fall day, O God, we are reminded of your love and your presence and your ongoing presence throughout all the ups and downs of history. We thank you that you continue to be with us no matter where we find ourselves, whether we are in joy or in mourning, whether we are finding ourselves struggling or enjoying life as it comes. Be with us in our conversations today. Help us to learn something new and surround us with your love and peace, we pray. In Christ's name. Amen. All right. The welcome to week 4. And so this marks we are approximately once we're done tonight, we are basically done 80% of what was outlined, and of course where we have been in terms of the overview. And in that overview, of course, we did the earliest days of Christianity up until um, a, approximately the first 30 to 40 years in there. Then, of course, Christianity in the Roman Empire. We talked about the Western Roman Empire last time, so 2 weeks ago. And then, of course, Remembrance Day last week. And then tonight we are doing, it's called Shining a Light on the Dark Ages. And that is in quotes because what we call the Dark Ages is really a misnomer. And I'll get into that. And then next week, then we get into what the conditions were as to why the Western Church and the Eastern Church split. Now, we are going to be covering some of that tonight. Just it's the precursors to all of this, um, and then of course the lasting impact of what that looked like. So, wanted to talk at least initially about, of course, this is a bit of a recap and what Christianity looked like after the fall of the Roman Empire. And when Rome was sacked, I mean, the Western Roman Empire just continued to crumble, um, because just the infrastructure, the power, with the what referred to, the what was referred to as the Goth invasions, uh, began to happen. And really, what those were, they weren't so much as invasion. Yeah, I mean, they were definitely military campaigns, but they were also a result of migration that was where you had the Germanic tribes getting pushed down into Western Europe and down into Italy earlier because of movements of Attila the Hun, for example. But eventually, what happened is in 476, Rome was sacked in 410, and then 66 years later, we have this barbarian warlord, this Gothic king, Odoacer, deposed the Roman emperor and assumed a rule over the entire Italian peninsula. Now, the thing is, the Germanic tribes themselves were Christian, but they were a part of uh, uh, the what is referred to as Arian Christian. In other words, they were uh, that Arianism was identified as one of the later heresies and I have to be careful about throwing heresies because you have this sort of parody of what that looks like in terms of the the various heresies were differences in belief and understanding, and things like the Nicene Creed were intended to establish kind of a baseline. Arian Christianity was a their particular beliefs they were largely Christian in terms of their understanding and following, but their understanding of the divinity of Christ was different from what the Nicene Creed was, and primarily was that if they understood Jesus to be a created being, not as sort of originating as like being essentially one and the same as God, but someone who came later. And for example, I mean, modern examples like Arianism would largely faded in Europe, but it found root in the Germanic tribes. It would kind of periodically show up, like we see, for example, examples of that in certain aspects of, for example, Unitarian Universalists, for example, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Are a couple of examples that would reflect a more Arian type theology when it comes to understanding. But you see, the trouble is that unfortunately in the West, the historical record became more difficult to trace down, and this is referred to as the beginning of what is known as the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages wasn't because it was like grim and gothic. It's just what's called the Dark Ages because we just don't have a lot of information of what was happening in Western Europe at the time. But what we do know is that when the Roman infrastructure collapsed, there was this large political void that happened, and you had local warlords themselves that assumed governance in various states and in various sizes. And those warlords eventually evolved into what we understand as feudal lords themselves. And so you had a whole series of small local rulers and kingdoms emerging rather than a large cohesive system. And at this point in time, it was only the churches in Western Europe that actually had an overarching organization that could provide a certain degree of leadership. They didn't necessarily want military or political leadership, but sometimes they kind of fell into that. Like, for example, there are bishops who ended up with armies because the political structure that initially provided that sort of defaulted to them. And at one point they didn't want it, and then a generation or two later they were very very protective of it. So just to give you an idea of how fragmented it looked, so you have Odoacer taking possession of basically the Italian peninsula and more or less the edge of the Balkan peninsula here. But look at all these other different tribes all through here, largely through this whole area. But notice you also have this Eastern Roman Empire, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. But you had just all of these different tribal groups in Western Europe that were each in their own separate area, taking up and keeping that rule. And so, unfortunately, because of that fragmentation of society, these smaller communities became much more important. And so, among those, you had the rise of monasteries, and they developed. You may remember from the last session, or more specifically, in session 3, we talked about desert fathers and mothers who would go out into the desert, more in the eastern part of the empire, because they were uncomfortable with the political power that the church now had, and they wanted to remove themselves from that. Well, similarly, in Western Europe, some of the students of those traditions in Western Europe began to set up these small communities, and that's where the practice and these the rise of monasticism in Western Europe began to rise. And as I mentioned before, the church's ecclesiastical structure, the organization in Western Europe, remained largely in place, and that's enabled them to communicate, enabled them um, to kind of slip into that vacuum. And they were also independent of political control of any one of those successor kingdoms. There was none of those successor kingdoms to the Western Roman Empire actually had any sort of dominance over the church governance. Um, Eventually those networks is they actually started to become uh, centers of influence themselves without any sort of political oversight over that. So the church was effectively completely independent of that, and so the Roman Church, the Western Church, started to become um, an extra national entity. In other words, that they operated in all of these different ones with a degree of recognized independence. And so at this point in time, the person who was the Bishop of Rome, who was the head of the Latin-speaking church, became more and more prominent because of that ability to move through all these communities. And this eventually evolved into what we now know as the papacy in the Roman Catholic Church. Although at this point in time, they weren't known as the Roman Catholic Church at that point in time. They were simply the Latin-speaking church in the West. But they were becoming more and more and more independent, and they also had more and more political influence over these smaller kingdoms. And so, and the other thing is, and this is an important part to know, is because the knowledge that had been generated in the the Roman Empire, these monasteries held on to it and they preserved it. And because one of the things is that even though literacy in the Roman Empire wasn't as, compared to what literacy is today, literacy in the Roman Empire was probably 5, 10, and even 20% in some places, which was the highest it had been in human history at that point. But during the so-called Dark Ages in the West, after the collapse of the Western Empire, literacy rates dropped down to a minuscule 6%. So it had been higher before, and it dropped during this time down to about 6%. And we then had, and of course, the majority of that 6%, beyond, say, nobles, and nobles who were specifically educated for the various lords, it was mostly monks, priests, nuns who could read. And that's also an important distinction. And they were preserving the knowledge to be carried forward from the Greco-Roman period, and that low literacy rate, that 6%, would remain in place until the Renaissance, which we don't even get to in this particular course. So keep in mind that the vast majority of people, 94% of the population of Western Europe could not read or write. But here's the thing. Did you know the Roman Empire didn't actually fall? I mean, it fell in the West, but it didn't actually fall because, and this is one of these things where it's a very Western-centric kind of view of history, that the Roman Empire fell in 476 when Odoacer deposed the Roman emperor. The fact is that the Western Roman Empire fell, completely collapsing in about 476. On the other hand, the Eastern Roman Empire continued and remained very much in power, and would continue to do so for almost another 1,000 years. It wouldn't be until the Ottoman Turks finally destroyed the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453. But the trouble is that from a historian's point of view, we refer to the Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. But the reality is that the Byzantine Empire understood themselves to be a continuation and a part of the Roman Empire. That's how they referred to themselves, even though they spoke Greek. But as a political overarching entity, they continue to exist. And just to make it distinctive, we talk about the Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire more as a shorthand description, but really they understood themselves to be a continuation, and in fact, the true heirs of the Roman Empire. So what I wanted to get into is that, of course, the capital, and some of this we've already covered. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was Constantinople, and the reason that it's called the Byzantine Empire is because Constantinople, well, basically Emperor Constantine refounded the city on an older Greek colony called Byzantium, and instead of keeping the name Byzantium, called it Constantinople after himself, as emperors tend to do. Can't tell you how many places in the middle in Turkey and the Levant are referred to have the name Antioch after a Seleucid emperor Antiochus, and so a bunch of cities have that name, including one of the ones we'll talk about today. So at this point in time, again, we talked about this last time, that Nicene Christianity, basically, those adhering to the Nicene Creed, was the official religion of the Roman Empire since 380. But unlike in the West, and of course in the West, the Western Church was a Latin-speaking church, so they adopted Latin in terms of its, and Latin was the common language in the Italian peninsula and points in Western Europe. They adopted Christianity into the newer language of Latin. And here's one of the things, is that Latin is often perceived as this old ancient language, where in fact actually Latin is the newer language and Greek is the older. In the Eastern Empire, they retained Greek. They continued to speak Greek. They continued to worship in those older Greek-based rites. But unlike the Western Church, where when you had this political collapse in the Western Church, in the Eastern Church, there was never a political collapse. So even though the Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, it was always under the authority of the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor, and so therefore it was always subject to leadership. So it didn't have that kind of unfettered independence that the Western Church did, and this does eventually have that kind of extended issues. And so, of course, the organizational structure in the empire itself impacted the structure of the church in those early days, and we're gonna get to some of that in terms of how certain things became formalized. So one of the most important things is during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, and if there is nobody else you remember, Justinian I, as far as is probably the most impactful of the emperors beyond Constantine. Well, actually, that's not true. Constantine Theodosius I, that made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But here we have, not quite 200 years later, Justinian I, and we have this under Justinian's reign between 527 and 565. Is that Justinian managed to start to reclaim the territory lost to the Visigoths, to the Ostrogoths, and eventually the Eastern Roman Empire reclaimed almost the entirety of the Western Roman Empire, but it was still, but the Western Roman Empire itself never never was never reestablished as a Western center. It was all governed out of Constantinople. And under Justinian, the Justinian the First, the Roman Empire actually gained its largest and widest extent, but it wasn't. It wouldn't be as the. It wouldn't be for long, and that even though in 555, and I've got a map coming up shortly as to what that looked like in terms of the territory that under Justinian the First. In terms of population, Justinian the First had the largest population of the Roman Empire, period. Except something did happen in the middle of this that actually made that much a little bit more difficult. Because even though the Eastern Roman Empire reclaimed all of that territory and reached its peak in 555, it was also dealing with the first major incident in the West of what would become known 800 years later as the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, or the Justinian plague, weakened the infrastructure so much so that even though it reached the peak of its reach and influence in 555, the infrastructure underneath it was so weakened that within about 20 years, within 10 years of that peak reach, eventually those gains in the West would be lost again, and the Western Empire and the Western Church came back under the purview of the warlords. So anyway, this is the Justinian Empire in its largest and greatest extent. You see here, it never regains the kind of reach that the Roman Empire did in the first century. They never got much past Europe, but Justinian was able to reclaim much of the Italian peninsula, but they wouldn't be able to hold on to it. And so one of the things that did come out of this was something referred to as the novella. This is an administrative number of a particular document, referred to as the Justinian Code. In other words, an establishment and an organization trying to establish a lasting organization within the Western Empire. And this happened, in this 20-year period. And it proposed a formalization of something that already had existed. Remember how I had mentioned before that there were centers of Christian thought that had already developed. Well, this formalized it into those 5 centers, namely Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And those, and in terms of those locations, the 692 would mark when that would be formalized, but the structure largely had been recognized at this point. And the proposal in this was to make sure that those understandings, those centers of Christian thought, also then had their centers and their reach of influence in terms of the different places. And then when they would have conferences, they would have representatives from each group coming together. Now, of course, Rome being Rome, and Richard, I hope you're smiling at this, Rome being Rome, they always claimed to be the first among equals. And I think part of it may have been a sort of a collective inferiority complex, because they were the only ones who spoke Latin as opposed to Greek. And so and of course they claimed Peter as being the first bishop of Rome. Whether that's historically accurate or not, there's a lot of room for doubt there. But there was this constant theme about wanting to be being the first, Rome wanting to be and claiming to be the first among equals. And this was certainly it was a tension. By the way, the flicker you see is I've got a light above me that is in process of burning out, so it looks like I'm being like a little bit of lightning above me. So no, I'm not about to be struck by lightning there, Richard.
No, I thought you were going to be beamed up, though.
Mm. Yeah. So anyway, the I got to get that fixed before next week. Yeah. But anyway, Rome would continue to claim to be first among equals, and this would continue for some time. But here's how that actually looked as a map. Now this the map itself. This is not is not in English. But you can see here in the in terms of the different areas, you can see the centers are different colors. So the pink color here, and you can even see here in Africa that the Western Roman Empire just off the edge was under the auspices of Rome in this area. This green section here, of course, there's Constantinople right there, and then you have this one here, and it's kind of interesting because you have this dark green here, but you also have the dark green that, at least to a certain degree, that Constantinople claimed at least ecclesial authority over Arabia down this way. But then you also have this area here is centered out of Antioch, and Antioch is right here. I'm assuming everybody can see my mouse. But we have Antioch here. So you've got Rome just off the map here. You've got Constantinople here, Antioch here, Jerusalem right here. That's the one that's labeled Hiroshima. That's basically a transliteration of Jerusalem. And then, of course, you have Alexandria here. And so you have your 5 centers: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the trouble is that this sort of setup seemed to work mostly in the East, where you had 4 Greek-speaking centers and 1 one Latin-speaking in the West. And it really became Rome versus everybody else. And because Rome the Roman center existed in an unstable political climate, they were not under the authority, as I mentioned before, under the authority of an existing imperial power. So they had a lot more freedom to grow as they saw fit, or as they had the ambition to do so. And to have the influence over nations as opposed to being subjected to one. Because of course, all those territories that just going back here, all of these territories here in the East, those were all under the Western Roman Empire, whereas in this area, it was not. And so as a result, in the East, all of the patriarchs of those different leaders, all of the leaders there were still on the leash of the Byzantine emperor. And now that said, I mean, the Byzantine state wanted, they wanted a cohesive church, and they sought to resolve disagreements. But curiously enough, when there were disagreements happening, it wasn't the church people who were doing it. It was the civic authorities that said, "Okay, you need to get together and sort this out." But of course, they didn't. In the West, they didn't have that. I mean, they still came when requested, but they weren't sort of necessarily ordered to do so. And so these different councils that they would have, like for example, in the Council of Chalcedon, we have the Oriental Orthodox split, and the Oriental Orthodox are what we now refer to as the Coptic Church, because they largely spoke Egyptian Coptic, and that's the center in Alexandria, but also the Ethiopian Orthodox in that way. And that's one of the reasons why you have different churches recognizing different books within within the Old Testament. For example, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the only church that recognizes the Book of Enoch as canonical, for example. And so we actually, the very first genuine split you actually had was in 451, where the Oriental Orthodox, because of a doctrinal difference, the had less and less contact with the business with Constantinople and the other church organizations. However, something else would be coming up. Now, this slide sort of revealed it all at once. Now, under Justinian, the church wanted to try and heal those divisions from the previous councils. Limited success. They wanted to try and bring those who objected to the Council of Chalcedon back in. Limited success with that. And the thing is, at this point in time, there wasn't this intent to exterminate the other side. They just kind of left them to their own devices. So Arianism, Nestorianism, which were variants on Christianity that were outside of Nicene Christianity, did continue to operate, particularly amongst the Gothic tribes for Arianism, but they eventually just kind of petered out on their own. And the Byzantine empire grew too large. And so, for example, under the Sassanid Empire, there were Christians in the Sassanid Empire that were no longer subject to Constantinople, and so they became they had long since again found themselves as to be independent. Oops, need to bring that back. And so it seemed to be the further away you got from the core of the Byzantine Empire and like the Byzantine Empire and the Western Roman Empire, or the remnants of the Western Roman Empire, the less it seemed to be that adherence to that Nicene like they still all agreed, they were still understood themselves to be Nicene Christianity, but there were subtle doctrinal differences that would eventually they would just start peeling off just a little bit, but not in the same way that, say, the Protestant Reformation would, 1,000 years later. And so what we had here is that when we talked last time, is we talked about the question of what do we do with power, and in the Byzantine Church, basically it was providing a spiritual backstop to the imperial authority, but they were always subject to it, and of course, and it was more about the imperial control of the church. And less about what they actually believed. I mean, there was a certain degree of that, but it still had to do with, in terms of the being under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire. And of course, you've heard I don't know if you've heard the phrase of some Byzantine plot, in other words, to describe a political machinations of immense complexity. Well, it's well earned, because it comes out of how they did politics in the Byzantine Empire. But of course, you had again the conflict with the Persian Empire, the Sassanids. Both of those during this time, you had the Western Roman Empire and all those different, the different tribes of the Goths in the Western Empire, where they were no longer able to exert the Byzantine Empire couldn't exert political control, and then with the Sassanids, the Persian Empire, they were again. There were constant territories, claims to rule, and Unfortunately, what this ended up happening is the empire collectively, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, especially during these conflicts, their conflicts with each other left them weakened at a very critical time. And so you have this is looking a little bit more east. You have the Byzantine Empire here. So this is modern day Greece. You have Constantinople here, and still a considerable reach. And you can see all the different tribes sort of up on the upper left. But here's the Persian Empire, the Sassanid dynasty, and also their areas of these pink areas are their areas of influence. But the conflict between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire weakened both of them and allowed for this, the rise of Islam. That you had both the Byzantines and the Sassanids weakened enough that what eventually happened is that just unsuspectingly, you have these Arab armies suddenly exploding out of nowhere in the middle of the 7th century, and enormous territorial losses. The Sassanid Empire basically collapsed under this suddenly unified Arab tribes coming out of like roaring out of the desert. Initially seeming to be these raiding parties, but there's something else organized behind it, and it would be a newly energized Arab population under the banner of a new prophet by the name of Muhammad. And this movement was different than the polytheistic polytheistic tribes that was common to Arabic culture at that point in time. It was and it identified it was radically monotheistic, as you can see here. It seemed to have ideas that were common with Judaism and Christianity, including identifying Jesus as a prophet, but its expression of that was very different than that expressed in the Nicene Creed, that Jesus was a prophet, but not seen as divine. But the thing is, it caught both the Sassanids and the Byzantine Empire off guard at this point in time. The unification came, and they just entered into what really was a power vacuum. And so what you have is that these Arab tribes united under Muhammad in the early 7th century. And of course, Islam in Arabic means submission to God. And I mean, some of this I've already said, is that they claim to be descendants of Ishmael from the Old Testament. And because both empires were weakened, the Arab these Arab tribes were able to move into what is effectively was a power vacuum. And so we have eventually what happens is that the Sassanid Empire, they moved against them first, and basically wiped out the Sassanid Empire, or at least took it over. And they established what are called caliphates, which are basically a caliph in Arabic just simply means steward. And so at the time they were largely seen as benevolent. You can see that they granted, at least with here, that they were actually welcomed quite openly, because they granted freedom, religious freedom of expression to both Jews and Christians through this time, and particularly Christians who felt themselves to be too much under the control of the Byzantines. They quite welcomed it. But the Eastern Orthodox Church themselves was actually seen as an extension of the Byzantine state. So for those Christians living in the areas that Islam came through, they certainly welcomed it. So this is how quickly the Islam expanded. So right under Muhammad, up to the borders of the Sassanid Empire, in just 10 years. So this dark brown area was just up to here. And then under over the next 30 years, they basically wiped out the Sassanid Empire, pushed the Byzantines back into Asia Minor. Any of the holdings that the Byzantines had in Egypt and Libya gone, and then future they would expand out into Afghanistan, Pakistan, or what we would now know as that, and all the way up into Spain, and they would remain there. They would remain in Spain until 1492. To give you an idea of how extensive that was. It was, if you look at the time between those first raids in the early 7th century to the middle of the 8th century, and it was like it rewrote the map. And because Islam stepped into a vacuum, and then of course at this point in time, the Byzantines were too busy worrying about Islam to worry about what was happening in the Western Roman Empire. It wouldn't really the West or the Western powers wouldn't really understand what was happening until until the latter part of the Islamic expansion had moved up into Spain. And so in this time, you have the Byzantine Empire is much weaker, and it was they could do very little to hold on to the territorial, but they lost enormous swaths of territory. And as you can see, the Umayyad dynasty basically expanded across. And so by the time that was over, these were the territories that were still under the control of the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. That it was just these territories, and therefore anywhere outside of this, and you can see Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. You have Rome still technically under at that point in time, still technically under the Byzantine Empire in terms of its holdings, but not much. And so you have these centers basically being outside of that communications corridor. So basically, of those centers of Christian thought, the only ones that are that weren't under Islam were basically Rome and Constantinople. So you had two. You went from 5 to 2. Even though these other centers did continue to operate, they were still under under Islam. And so what we had is again the Petrarchy, those five centers, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, now all under Islamic control, and because of that, they had been left out by those church councils. They had a certain degree of newfound freedom, but also less influence in terms of the core centers of Christianity. And some of those ideas, particularly in the Council of Chalcedon and that sort of thing, people who were disgruntled with that, they actually they found fertile ground inside of Islam in terms of some of those ideas. And of course, mentioned before, Byzantine Church anywhere outside the empire, if they were of basically the Greek-speaking or Orthodox expression of Christianity, they were seen as being an extension of the Byzantine government and therefore viewed with suspicion. And then of course under Islamic rule there was a certain degree of independence, but there ended up being, this then started a crisis within the Byzantine Church. And one of the things was, it just seems to be kind of strange, but when there is a political crisis, people often turn to the weirdest things to blame. And basically, when all of these territorial losses happened so quickly over, granted, I mean, you don't think of 150 years as being a quick loss, but considering after so many so many centuries of rule, to suddenly have so little in the way of uh in terms of, as compared to what they once had, there was this sense of soul searching. And curiously enough, what they found to blame was, well, in addition to that, there were also some natural events, and that you had this volcanic eruption in the Aegean Sea that Santorini blew up in 726, and all of these things were interpreted as signs convincing the Byzantine emperor that the empire had lost favor with God. Particularly, it seemed that God seemed to have effectively delivered, under the auspices of Mohammed, so much territory to the expanding Arabs under Islam. And looking for something to blame, they oddly enough, they fixated on something called, on their use of icons or images in worship. And similar, curiously enough, that probably was in contact with the rise of Islam, because Islam itself does not have, as part of its worship, having images of things, or at least in terms of the understanding of Islam that at this point in time developed. I mean, there would be, pictures of leaders and things like that would come later with the development of the different strains of Islam. But in terms of this, there became this almost backlash to a very common spiritual practice, particularly in the Eastern Church, of the use of the of using images in worship, namely, or what we refer to as icons. And again, this kind of reflects on some of that influence, some of that Islamic influence, that it was all about the word. And so you would have writing, but you wouldn't have images, or you wouldn't have drawn images, or at least to be used in the context of worship. And so Leo III chose to ban the use of icons, and that would last for 57 years. Now, if you're wondering, what does an icon look like? Well, here's and of course, the Western Church certainly like to use icons, like basically the images of Mary, the images of Jesus, these depictions. In the West, there were both statues and icons. In the East, there's a certain style to what these icons look like, and I'm just going to bring one up here. This one is actually is one that actually comes from before the Leo III's ban. So this particular one shows an image of Jesus, and it was icons like this that they banned, and for almost 60 years didn't use in the Byzantine Church as well. And it would be the constant focus of the discussions throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, and would continue to be. And then, of course, ultimately, and particularly even in the Eastern Church today, the use of icons is eventually a big part of that, and it was something very much, but it was part of the tensions that we're building. And you might think, well, this is kind of like the angels on a head of a pin. Well, there were divisions that around trivias like that, but keep in mind the psychological impact of how much the Eastern Roman Empire lost when with the rise of Islam. Whereas in the Western Empire, in the Western Church, Latin-speaking Church, that impact was not felt anywhere to the same degree, because they didn't, the political structure in the West had long been smashed, and they were assuming degrees of power and influence. The only time that they started to encounter what that might have been was with the arrival of the Umayyads in Spain, and they got a good way up the Iberian Peninsula and would remain there for another 700 years. But at the same time, they never really got past that point. So anyway, that's largely. I'm sitting here coming close to 8 o'clock. That's sort of the presentation of where we ended up. And so next week we're going to be looking at the next 200 years and all this situation of what happens when you have the Western Latin speaking church that has increasingly political control over a number of disjointed states versus the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Church being under the Eastern Empire, and its favor rising and falling with the fortunes of the empire itself, and how that sort of turned out, and what that eventually leads to in the next 200 years. So that's for next week. But I am certainly open to any sorts of questions that you have. And I see Richard, you've brought your camera up.
Yeah, that's because the image that you just showed, is that not also from an Islamic temple that initially was a church, then they flipped it all around, and now it's literally Islamic words, but there's still part of that image that is still on one of their walls. I just recently seen it on TV, and I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, well, this particular image, no, but images like this, yes.
It was very, very similar. Other than where the Bible is gone, you see the halo, the face. The image is very, very similar.
Yeah, and this sort of particular style was very, very common and continues to be common in the Eastern Orthodox traditions. If you were to look up Eastern Orthodox iconography today, you would still get it. Even though this particular image is like, is 1400 years old. A lot of the Eastern Orthodox images and icons look like this.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that within the Catholic Church, they, with all the icons and stuff, I mean, I personally still have the picture I got from my mom of the Virgin Mary holding and it is very, very similar in style. It's what they use in the novena.
Yeah.
That people think that we worship them when it was never that. It was more to inspire than to. And then, of course, I come into the United Church, and there's barely nothing.
Yeah, and in the Western Church, in the Western Protestant churches, we also had a fairly strong iconoclastic movement in the early parts of the Reformation, where people would go and break stained glass windows because they viewed them as sort of in the same way as this brief period of iconoclasm in the Eastern Empire became a recurring theme in sort of independently of each other, but became a recurring theme during the Reformation. I mean, the first Presbyterian church I ever served in, there was a brass cross that was placed on the communion table, and apparently it took them 10 years from the point at which that cross was donated to the church to someone actually taking the cross and dropping it on the communion table. Because
now, is it just the cross, or was Jesus Christ on it?
No, it's just the cross. I mean, the cross said had the IHS on it, which means Jesus Hominum Salvatori. So it was Latin. Jesus, Savior of humanity, is what that's supposed to mean. That IHS, if you ever see that.
Mm-hmm.
And that symbol is actually fairly common, particularly in various Protestant churches and Presbyterian ones, in terms of that Latin label. But yeah, there were, and I think it was a case of like Cornwall, because Cornwall has a fairly large Roman Catholic population, or at least it did. And so when you have a Presbyterian church putting even just a simple brass cross on a table, some said, well, that's very popish. And it's like, anyway, all it
But
took.
is that not like sorry, like St. Andrews has a picture? Is it not of a shepherd? I forget now because I was
Mm,
focused on it.
the image
So
and
it's still subliminal, but it's still because I look and I go, oh, I really like that because
yeah,
I can associate with it a little.
yeah.
Whereas
Well,
when I walk into our own church, I go, other than the cross, that's it.
yeah, we have the quilted Last Supper, but
Yeah, that.
you're right. We tend to be very simplistic in terms of those designs. The image at St. Andrews is actually I can't remember I think it's referred to as Jesus, the light of the world. And the reason why that one's particularly iconic in a Protestant, it's one of the few ones that it is an image of Jesus, and he's holding a light, but he's knocking on a door that does not have a handle on the outside.
Mhm.
And and that comes with the more evangelical. The idea is that Jesus is knocking on the door, and it's up to you to let him in. That's the purpose of that particular image. And I remember actually the Presbyterian church that I served, same Presbyterian church that was arguing over whether or not to put a cross. One of the stained glass the windows had that image in it, which I find hilarious because they were okay with that image that had been up there for much longer versus an actual physical cross to put on the table. But eventually they got the cross on the table. Going back to this though. Your original question in terms of there is a very, very, very large mosque in Istanbul, used to be Constantinople.
Mhm.
Should bring up the They Might Be Giants song. Um, but and it's referred to as the Hagia Sophia. Um, and at one point it was one of the main Eastern Orthodox churches in Constantinople. But when the Ottoman Turks eventually took Constantinople, they turned that church into a mosque, and they largely covered up everything. But of course, and that was around um, mid 1400s is when that happened. But all they did is they didn't destroy the icons. They just simply effectively paved over them. But as time has worn on, even though it's relatively recent, those images have now been revealed, and they've chosen, even though it is a mosque, they've chosen to leave those images up.
Mhm.
You
I
know,
think that's what I'd seen because I was
yeah.
like, I was so interested to see just how they have these humongous big symbols of
Mm.
words.
Yeah.
And,
So
and then in the next print, it's like, oh, but this is still sort of sneaking out because this is still
yep.
a part of the history.
So here, it's called the Hagia Sophia. In If you can go look that up on
I will do that. I think Rick Steves just recently had it on one of his because he
yep,
travels all around the world and
yep,
stuff. That
mm,
he was there and he had pointed some of this stuff out. That it was like, oh wow, because he was also doing stuff about Rome,
yep,
Jerusalem,
yep,
Constantinople, everywhere
yep,
because it was
and
a religious aspect he was covering.
yep. So
But I think that's where I see in it.
yeah, and also do keep in mind is the influence that Constantinople and Rome had. They were both very powerful influences, but of
Mhm.
course in the modern world, once the you know once Constantinople fell to the Turks, that was the last of those the only center of Christian thought that remained under basically effectively Christian, for lack of a better term, would be Rome. And that's one of the reasons why Rome has become as powerful as it is today, because it became the last center. I mean, these centers of thought still existed, but they never. after the fall of the Constantinople in 1453, it would never have that degree of influence then. Whereas prior to that, the Western Church and the Eastern Church, or the Roman Church and the Constantinople Church were actually effectively on equal footing, but Constantinople was always under the empire, whereas the Roman Church was always over the local city states and warlords, or they were tolerated by, and eventually they began to assert power, which we will talk about next week.
Yeah.
Because particularly when the crowning of Charlemagne in 800 is a very, very important watershed of that gaining of power in the West. That we'll talk about.
Thanks for that.
Oh, no problem at all. Any other questions at this point? Because I'm realizing here I am at 8 o'clock, and I just kind of blew through this, but I'm happy to linger back and address any other questions. I realize, Betty, when I was talking to you earlier in terms of coming at the end of this and your brain feeling kind of full, which I get, because at one point it was me on the other end of this, and so I guess, is there any parts of the fire hose you want me to go back to and try and reduce it to a trickle a bit?
No, it's
you're
mic's
okay.
not on.
You are muted, Betty, but you're okay. Okay, you're okay. Good. All right. And this, again, it was a bit of a whirlwind, but what I wanted to try and show you is that quite often we've been so focused on what's been happening in the West that really there's a lot of very interesting history happening in the East that would have a later impact on how we understand and how the church developed. So, and the only part of early Christianity that doesn't necessarily explain things is what I just covered, is that the influence of the Eastern Church would continue pretty solidly up until the eventual fall of the Byzantine Empire, and then it almost became, and that's one of the reasons why we almost exclusively see the Western Church, because the Byzantine Empire falls. Then you get about a period of about approximately about 60 years between the Roman Empire, the Roman Church, and at this point there has been a full split at that point. But you get a period between where the Roman Catholic Church is exclusively the only sort of independent Christian organization that isn't under the influence of Islam at this point in time. And then about 60 years later, then you have the divisions happening within the church, and then eventually the exploding of the Protestant Reformation in 1517. But that's 500 years, about 500 years after we're done, after this section here. So we are ending with what the great split between Constantinople and the Roman Church. And that's where we're getting to next week. So if there's no more questions, I will let you loose to go tie down whatever furniture you need to with the impending storm that's coming up.
Yes. Mm-hmm. All right.
All right. So I'll stop recording once everybody is out. But again, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Please do stay safe in tomorrow's weather. I mean, the real peak of the storm doesn't hit until about this time tomorrow night. But I am hoping everybody stays safe, and hopefully you don't lose too many shingles off your roof.
Mm-hmm.
Or worse yet, have a tree a tree come down. We for those of you who weren't here, we canceled Cubs for tomorrow night because normally we meet at Camp Callet, which is out in the woods with a whole lot of
Mhm.
trees, and when you have winds that it looks like they're going to peak at 100 kilometers an hour, the it just keeps safe. So
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, hi, Marilyn.
All right.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, John.
bye and thank you, and I'll see everybody. Well, if not sooner, I'll see you next week for sure.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Stop recording.